Welcome to the Learn the Word podcast, where you will be challenged to grow in your knowledge of the Word of God and your relationship to the God of the Word, where we will discuss issues of Bible interpretation as well as matters of practical application. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, Academic Dean of the Word of Life Global Bible Institute. Our main campus is here in Scroon Lake, New York, and we have 10 additional accredited teaching sites around the world. To learn more about the Word of Life Bible Institute, visit us at wordoflife.edu. That's wordoflife.edu. Today, we continue our second part in our two-part podcast series on the lives of two very important, notable characters from the Old Testament. Last week, we studied the life of Abraham, who is the father of the Jewish people, and today we are going to discuss David, the king who is a man after God's own heart. Both of these individuals received a promise from God with significant implications for the Jewish people and all mankind. And to discuss the life of David, I welcome back two very special guests. They both serve on the staff of Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. My first guest on today's podcast and last week's podcast is Chris Katulka. Chris is the Assistant Director of North American Ministries, as well as the radio and podcast host for the Friends of Israel Today radio program. He is a contributor to Israel My Glory magazine. He has a Bachelor of Science from Cairn University and a Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary with an emphasis in Old Testament studies. Chris is also an adjunct faculty member of the Word of Life Bible Institute, a fan favorite, I might add. The only one that I know of where students have created T-shirts with his likeness on them.
That's my favorite.
Chris has been a guest on this podcast before. Chris, welcome back to Learn the Word podcast.
Glad to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Now, do you have your own T-shirt that they made of you? Do you have a version yourself?
I did keep one.
Okay.
Yeah, I did keep one.
I didn't know.
My wife says I can't wear it in public though, because you can't wear a picture of yourself.
That'd be a little arrogant, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
All right. Well, my second guest today is Steve Herzig. Steve is the North American Director for Friends of Israel. He has been on staff with Friends of Israel for 42 years. He's a graduate of Philadelphia Biblical University, known today as Cairn University. He's also a graduate of Kent State. He's a regular contributor to Israel My Glory magazine, is a highly sought-out conference speaker, Bible college lecturer, and is the author of a book entitled Jewish Customs and Culture, as well as its sequel, More Jewish Customs and Culture. Steve, welcome back to Learn the Word podcast.
Hey, Paul, thanks a lot. Great to be here.
Well, I can't say enough good things about the ministry of Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. Word of Life and Friends of Israel are two like-minded ministries. We have a great deal of theological and philosophical compatibility, and our ministries have had a great deal of cooperation over the years. Steve, before we jump into the subject matter of today's podcast, would you briefly share with our listeners what FOI, or Friends of Israel, is all about?
Well, I can't tell you how thankful I am to be here and to be given that question, because Friends of Israel is really significant to me personally. I can give you the mission statement that we have as an organization. We have a magazine called Israel My Glory magazine, and that mission statement is not just in the magazine, it's everything that we do. And Friends of Israel, we're told, is the evangelical, worldwide evangelical ministry proclaiming biblical truth about Israel and the Messiah, but at the same time bringing physical and spiritual comfort to the Jewish people. Now, that's a great mission statement. Let me just tell you how it practically played out for me. You mentioned I've been with the organization for 42 years. That's true. That means first that I'm old, but it also means that I have been part of a ministry that is reaching out to Jews and Gentiles alike, but very, very conscious of Israel. We're an evangelical organization that emphasizes truth about Israel and Messiah. Well, 45 years ago to this month that we are taping in September, I took a trip to California, and unbeknownst to me, I ended up in a Bible study where I was introduced to the Messiah himself. And that Bible study, I mentioned in the last podcast that it was bagels, lox, and cream cheese, and eating all that I could brought me to that study. But that study was hosted by the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. So I am living testimony to the mission statement of the organization. I was one person who was touched by the ministry, and as a result, not only came up on board, but a vehicle to be used to touch other lives that touch their lives. And so Friends of Israel is significant to me personally, but it's been significant to Jewish people alike and the nation of Israel as we have stood with them because God stands with them. It's a very, very significant thing. God loves the Jewish people. God loves us. And as believers, we should love what God loves. And if God loves Israel, then we should love Israel. And it's been a real testimony to me throughout the history of my time with the organization, just how many, I bet you could say the same thing too, Paul, with Word of Life, just how many people are in love with the Bible, in love with Jesus Christ, in love with God's people, his chosen people. And so it's significant. And this mission statement that we have is one that it gives us flexibility to go all around the world and take care of the physical needs, just as Jesus did, but also proclaim the spiritual aspect. So it's a privilege for Chris and I to be here and to talk about it.
Well, I'm very glad to have you both on this podcast, this one and last episode, not only because of your knowledge of the subject matter, but because I love to highlight like-minded ministries that Word of Life fully supports and is excited about. And so I want to encourage our listeners and viewers to become more acquainted with Friends of Israel. If you haven't already, you can visit them at foi.org, FOI for Friends of Israel.org, and you can learn more about the ministry, and you can find ways that you can partner with them as well. Well, Chris, what do we know about David's childhood? We're going to talk about David today. What do we know about David's childhood, his tribe, family life?
Yeah, David, I actually think a lot of the Old Testament is driving us to the story of David. He's going to become a very influential character in the entire scriptures. Like Abraham did, you're going to see David become the same character. The only character we're missing, Paul, is Moses. I mean, you get Moses in there, we got a good portion of the scriptures covered here. But David is going to be somebody that I think you see, pictures of in the Torah and the Pentateuch, driving us to who he is eventually going to become. You go back to something like Genesis chapter 49, as Jacob is blessing the different tribes of Israel, and it gets to Judah in Genesis chapter 49:10, and it says that the scepter will not depart from Judah, which means that there's a kingship element that's going to come from Judah. Where did that come from? Of all the people to pick to become the kingly line of Israel, you might have thought it would have been one of Jacob's beloved sons, the ones that he, Joseph or Benjamin, that special relationship that you see take place in Genesis. But what happens is you see Judah becomes the primary tribe from which rulership would come. And so as you begin to trace even further, you get to a book like Ruth, a beautiful story, which we're not going to go through the story, but at the very end, I actually think the whole purpose of Ruth is to get us to who the person of David is. I mean, this is the way Ruth chapter 4 ends in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son. They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So you see, like at the end of Ruth, and then we have a whole genealogy that gets us to David. So even Ruth is setting us up for the story of the next book, which will be 1 Samuel, of who David would be. So David actually comes from the house of Perez. His father is Jesse, and they live in the town of Bethlehem, which is the house of bread. It's a very fertile area in Judah. It's only about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. And David, we know from the scriptures, is a shepherd. I mean, he's the youngest of the sons, and he's a shepherd boy, and he is the one that's taking care of the sheep the goats. And so his family's very agricultural family at that time. And so, this is who David is. He's in the tribe of Judah. And you see this early picture of who he is, that the writer of Samuel's given us an idea of who his father is, who his family is, and essentially how God is molding him at a young age as a shepherd, for eventually what he would become as king. And so this is kind of the background of who David is. He's a handsome boy too. That's what they really want to highlight. He's a handsome guy. And so that's David.
Well, you mentioned Moses. I initially thought I'd invite you to do a 3-part series, but I thought that'd be a little too presumptive of all of you. You are busy men, but maybe another time we'll have to have you back on and we'll talk about Moses as well. But that's why we're talking about David and Abraham, right? Because they're so monumental in the history of the Jewish people, and then also the future of the Jewish people. But
Yes.
Moses is a big hero of the faith as well, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Steve, what were the criteria that God used in selecting David amongst his brothers or even amongst all his countrymen?
Well, we know that God is a sovereign God, first of all. He does what he wants, when he wants, to who he wants, for whatever reason he wants. But as you look at 1 Samuel chapter 16, I think it's fair to say in verse 7 that we get that question answered. It says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him." He's speaking because of Saul, who is a head taller and all that. So he said, "For the Lord does not see as a man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Man, that last part of that verse is, yes, we have prophecy. We had to follow the seed from Genesis chapter 3. And as Chris was talking about Ruth, the genealogy becomes very important. And God is a sovereign, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God, knows exactly how that seed has to be preserved and kept. And it goes directly to David. But isn't it interesting that when we look at 1 Samuel chapter 16 and the end of that verse, "But the Lord looks at the heart." You get to see that heart a little bit further, just the very next chapter, when David takes those 5 stones and says, "You come with sword and buckler, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." I mean, David had a heart for God. That is so significant and something that every person, when they read the scripture, has to say about David. Man, his heart was knit to God. He had a heart that it's not said about a lot of people. He had a heart for God. And so when you ask the question, what was the criteria? What better criteria than he had a heart for God? When you hear testimonies of people, one of the strands, I think, that I've found over the years, when you hear testimony, Jew or Gentile, is that there was some little thing, fabric, some little thing the person might say, regardless of their religious background or even no religion at all. There's something in their life that they sensed was missing. There's something that they yearned for and they couldn't quite figure it out. I know for me, I was raised in an Orthodox setting, and I always talked to God. I didn't know fluent Hebrew. I learned the prayers, but I used to pray every night and said, "I know, Lord, I should be able to speak to you in heaven, the heavenly language, and I know we pray the liturgy. I just want to talk to you. And I'm sorry it's in English, but I want to talk to you." That's the kind of little nugget that is much more prevalent in David's life, that he had a heart for God. And when you see the promises and the way God used him, his heart for God took a little and made it much.
And really, when we're selecting leaders in the church and in the ministry, right, that needs to be first and foremost above education and experience, but a man after God's own heart, right?
Yeah, and I'll add too, I think it's interesting that the writer highlights the idea that David was a shepherd. That when you're going to be a king, that's not kind of the thing you want on your CV is, shepherd. There's a reason for that, though. And I think that, the one thing that you see is, as Steve was saying, he's a man after God's own heart. And he's also a man who loves his people. And you see that in the tenderness that a shepherd has. And it's funny because in the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, you have that idea of a shepherd is not only just someone who's leading sheep and goats around and caring for them, but he's also identified as a leader, whether he's a religious leader or a king figure. That's why Jesus is called the Good Shepherd. He's not just, he's actually wants to lead the people of Israel. And so, you see that nurturing component in David early on as well, that he's a shepherd boy. And that's going to really play out, I think, in the way that he is viewed and how he prepares himself to be king.
Well, there are so many great stories, aren't there, about David in the Old Testament, his godly character and trust in the Lord, as Steve also already referenced when defeating Goliath, right? Or refusing to cause harm to Saul, God's anointed one, even though Saul was seeking to kill him. Chris, would you speak to some of that character qualities of David in his early life and beginning of his reign?
Yeah, I think David, when he took control of Israel, when you get into 2 Samuel, you see a couple things happening with David. Number one, David immediately, I think he really looked at himself not only as the political leader of Israel, but really a spiritual leader as well. He brings the ark into Jerusalem. Number one, he makes Jerusalem the capital of Israel. He does this on purpose. He wants to unify the tribes. A part of the character of who he is he understands that the tribes can't live in separation. The tribes, even though they're different tribes, need to be unified under the one true God. And so what you have is David moves from Hebron down to Jerusalem, makes Jerusalem the capital, and Jerusalem is properly placed in a location that can unify the tribes of Israel. It's got significance to it. And so he captures Jerusalem. He makes it the capital. He brings the ark into Jerusalem, again, showing God's identity. He's excited that God's presence is there. So you see he's a spiritual leader in many ways. He's not a priest, but he's a spiritual king that loves the Lord and wants that to permeate the kingdom as he unifies the tribe. So number one is kingdom unification. I think you see that in the way that he wanted to lead his people. There's a lot of separation among the tribes in Saul's time. And then even in the book of Judges, you see everything ends up a mess at the end of book of Judges. As you come into Saul's time, there's still a mess among the tribes. David finds a way to unify all of them. And he does it from an angle of making sure the Lord is the one who is known as the King of Israel. That's really important. And the other is that you see that desire for David and his character to not only want to unify the tribes, but to fulfill what God had made a promise to Abraham for, which was to reach the boundaries of the promise, boundary lines that he was giving for Israel. He had pushed the enemies back. He took the Philistines to the west. He conquered the Philistines. He conquered the Edomites. He conquered the Moabites. He conquered the Ammonites. All of these different people groups that were encroaching on the land that God had promised the Jewish people. Abraham took seriously this relationship that he had with God, the covenant that God made to Abraham, and he was able to push them back and to build some notoriety to the land as well. Another character thing, but a character quality of David is he's a warrior. Yeah, he's a shepherd, as we talked about, but this man had a serious intellect when it came to battles and war and how to defeat enemies. So you see him as somebody with that character quality and trait as well. And so those are kind of the things that David's doing. I mean, he really did a lot for the kingdom early on. You see his accomplishments right away. And you even see that early on in Saul's day as well. When he was with Saul, the people loved David. And it got to Saul. You could see it. He was a warrior, and it irked Saul so much, his ego, because the people loved David. So you could even see that early on in 1 Samuel as well.
And it's not that he just loved going to war, right? It's that he wanted to accomplish what God had called him to do and to see God's kingdom expand, huh?
That's exactly what it is. Kingdom unification among the people of Israel, and then kingdom expansion as he's fulfilling the purpose that God had called his people to do.
Well, Steve, as you know, 2 Samuel 7 records what's called the Davidic Covenant. And could you explain to our listeners and viewers what is the Davidic Covenant all about?
Well, last week we talked about Abraham, the land, the seed, and the blessing. This is the seed portion, which starts in Genesis chapter 3, where we have the seed of the woman. And you know, it's, if I can tell you a short story, Jewish people like to tell stories. They make good illustrations, hopefully. I remember a number of years ago going to a pastor's house and knock on the door. I'm going to spend the weekend there. And the lady answered the door, was his wife, and she said, "Oh, pastor's downstairs and he's watching a dog show." A dog show. Well, you're a guest in somebody's house, you watch the dog show. And it's a big one, the Westminster Dog Show, which has become a pretty big deal. And you're looking at all these dogs. It doesn't matter to me. I don't know anything about dogs, but you'd see under the banner and the show, this dog is the son of Fufu, who was the daughter of somebody, and they're all named sophisticated names. And so the pastor was telling me, no matter what that dog looks like, if it doesn't have the proper papers, it's worthless. Here's these beautiful dogs, and oh no, you have to have the papers. So backtrack from that time that I was at the pastor's house to the time I opened up the New Testament for the first time. And I opened up to the book of Matthew. And I got to tell you, it was hard for me. The first book in the New Testament, a book I never read in my life, was not interested in reading. It's a Gentile book. And how does it start off? Whenever you read a book, how does it start off? The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And I just said to myself, this is not going to be good. For the next several verses, all I read is somebody begot somebody. I was reading in the King James Version. Somebody begot somebody and somebody begot. This is the way you're starting a book and you want me to read it? This is terrible. The wisdom of God. Why is it significant? Because God was going in the book of Matthew, as we also have the genealogy in Luke, but God in Matthew is going to talk about the king. The king. So who is it? Well, we could describe what the king does. We could say how great he is, how wise he is, even the miracles he does. But who is he? What's his genealogy? It doesn't mean anything if he's not the real McCoy. So you go back to Samuel and you find out that in this covenant is this seed culmination of Genesis chapter 3, the seed of the woman and the God of Abraham. Abraham had more than one son ultimately, but it was Isaac. Isaac had more than one son, but it was Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, but it was Judah. Judah had many sons, but it was Benjamin, through Judah. And then ultimately we come here to the specific person in the seed of David. I have to tell you, when you're talking about a thing this big and you narrow it down, so it says in 2 Samuel, verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I'll set up your seed after you, and it'll come from your body, and I'll establish his kingdom. That's talking certainly in context about Solomon. He's going to build a house for my name. I'll establish his throne for a kingdom forever. Well, wait a minute. Solomon can't be forever. No human being immediately from David's loins. Immediately could be. And then it says, he shall build a house for my name. I'll establish his throne for a kingdom forever. I'll be his father. He'll be my son. Drop down to verse 16. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. David's throne, David's seed would be that seed talked about by Matthew and by Luke. And so that book that I thought was so boring, what a stupid way to start a book, never going to hold my attention, yet anything else I would read would be insignificant unless this seed is the exact person who had the proper papers, the right pedigree in order to sit on that throne. And I'm no expert on kingdoms, but I know in England it's a big deal. The person who sits on the throne has to have the right pedigree. Everything is predicated on the pedigree. And God was very careful through this seed promise that it would be traced from Genesis and going all the way to where we see him in the book of Revelation as the right person, the only person, the promised seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to sit on that throne, which is David's throne, but ultimately the throne that will be David's throne where the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords sits upon.
Yeah, I love that point. I love how Matthew begins his gospel, right? Writing to a Jewish audience, he's very clear. The record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he's telling them right up front, I'm going to prove to you that the Messiah, Jesus, is the Messiah, and I'm going to give you his pedigree. And of course, that's the genealogy that you alluded to there. So I love that. Written to a Jewish audience, that's what they want to know, don't they?
Absolutely.
Well, last week, Chris, I asked you the same question about the Abrahamic Covenant. How do we know that the Davidic Covenant is unconditional, that it's not yet been fulfilled, and it's not a spiritual or symbolic fulfillment, but a literal future reign of the Messiah, Jesus Christ?
Well, when you go back to 2 Samuel 7, again, there is no predication on David's faithfulness to the covenant here. Actually, it says that God would be the one who would fulfill it. It says this in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It says, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will himself establish a house for you. And when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. And so, for David, what he's looking at is he's thinking, my line is going to continue forever. This throne will never end, in the sense that I'll have someone in perpetuity that sits on it. But see, so David in his mind is thinking that there's going to be somebody who comes and he will establish, it says actually there in 7:14, he will establish this kingdom forever. And so in no way is this abrogated, if you will, that all of a sudden God changes his mind. When David's thinking about his throne, David's not thinking of some heavenly throne in the distance. He's thinking of a physical, earthly throne. And God made a promise to him that he would one day see that fullness completed. You'll have a son who will sit on it in perpetuity, forever. Your kingdom will be established forever. And so there is this understanding that I don't think goes away in the mind of Jesus. I don't think it goes away in the mind of Paul. I don't think it goes away in the mind of John and the other gospel and New Testament writers, that you see over and over again the significance that David is important to who Jesus is. You see it in the Gospels, like we had just mentioned. In Romans, Paul opens Romans by saying Jesus is not only the Son of God, but he's also the Son of David. There's a divine element and a human element of the fact that Jesus is the Son of David. He will come and rule in the Davidic throne. In Revelation chapter 22, there is this, Jesus reminds the people once again at the very end, I am the root and descendant of David. There is this hope and anticipation, yet still, that Jesus is going to return and fulfill the purposes that were intended. The king will come to the kingdom that he's establishing and rule from his Davidic throne. So you see that over and over again, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament.
So when you see the word forever, the millennial kingdom is 1,000 years, but then goes on into eternity future. Is that how you would understand the term forever?
Yeah, that actually, I was speaking not long ago with a colleague here, Dr. Mike Stollard, and he likes to say that the millennial kingdom is just the kickoff party for eternity. And so that's the idea of what the millennial kingdom is. God finally subdues the enemies completely by the end of the millennial kingdom, and then we enter into the state of eternity, essentially. And so I like that mentality. The millennial kingdom is just the kickoff party to this eternal state.
Yeah, well, when you're talking eternity, 1,000 years is very few, right? That's
just a drop in the bucket.
Well, Steve, what are some of the implications of the Davidic Covenant for Israel as a nation and for the church as blessed by Israel and the kingdom?
You know, when we think of Israel and the church, probably the best place to go to kind of talk about that is the 70 weeks of Daniel. The 70 weeks of Daniel in chapter 9 tells us that they're for your people and for your holy city. That's what, when we read Daniel, well, who's Daniel's city? Who is Daniel's people? Well, they're Jews and Jerusalem, Israel. And so in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, he outlines these 70 weeks, which we believe the 70th week is yet to happen. And that 70th week is called by Jeremiah as the time of Jacob's trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wish personally as a human being that it wouldn't have been Jacob's trouble. But the fact that he calls it Jacob's trouble means, quite frankly, that it's a Jewish thing. That this trouble, in Yiddish we would say tsuris, this trouble is uniquely Israel. It belongs to Israel. They get blessings, but they also get curses. And when you read what Daniel is saying, this 70th week, which is outlined in Revelation 6 through 19, it's not good. The living conditions are not good. It's a time of wrath when God pours out his wrath. So the implications for Israel is God has a promise. They have yet to recognize as a nation their Messiah. And before they do that, they are going to go through the most awful time, and that includes terrible times that have already happened. I have family members who died in the Holocaust. 1/3 of the Jewish people died in the Holocaust. But there's a place where it talks about in Zechariah 2/3 of the Jewish people are going to die. That's the time of unprecedented wrath poured out by God upon the Jewish people. And then they will recognize Jesus when he comes, as we've already talked about. Chris talked about the 1,000-year rule, which is in Israel, and then the new heavens and the new earth. Yes, it's great. But what about the church? Well, the church, in God's grace and in his sovereignty, there's another people, a people that in Acts chapter 2, the Jewish people preached to. They preached to their own. Jewish people got saved. There was some difficulty. Hey, is this for Gentiles as well? Is this something we could talk to the Gentiles about? Yeah, and God used the book of Acts to tell us historically how Gentiles got involved in it. And so today it's Jews and Gentiles, the church. We are certainly going to be in the millennium, serving with Christ as he rules. But the church is a different entity, a blessed entity, but different blessing than the blessing that Israel has. You could say that Israel is the earthly people that God is going to bless. And in a literal sense, there will be literal physical people in the millennial kingdom having literal physical regular children who have to believe in the Messiah when he's sitting on the throne. And it boggles my mind that there'll be many who won't believe in him. But either way, there are physical people. The church is this unique people called out by God. You and I, and we're trying to reach people in the church who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, for by grace we're saved through faith. It has nothing to do with ourselves. It's the gift of God. And so here is this church, and what are we promised? We're promised in connection with this physical people, we will forever be with him. We're raptured up before this terrible period of time. And wherever Christ is, we are. We're going to be glorified and be just like him to reign and rule with him. Hey, either way, if you're one of the blessed physical Israelites who finally recognize the Messiah, you were fortunate enough to be alive and believe, you're going to have a blessed life. But it's different than part of the church. The church is different and unique. And why we have breath, and I know why Word of Life has breath, we want as many people to know about them so that they can be part of the family of God and have that unique relationship that was unbeknownst to the prophets. They didn't know about it. The church is a mystery revealed, and what a blessing it is. Right, Chris?
Definitely. Paul, can I add something too about the Davidic Covenant that I think is important? There is a universal nature to the Davidic Covenant that I think is a part of what the blessing is for the church as well. But it's interesting that when you go back, I once had a Jewish guy, a good friend of mine in Dallas. He said to me, Chris, since we're good friends, I just want to tell you something. I can disprove Christianity. I can disprove it. But I feel like you and I are close enough that I can tell you how, without hurting your feelings. I said, have at it, my friend, go right for it. And he said, God never intended to have a son. There is no son. And I said, can I show you something from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible? Yeah, sure, go ahead. I said, I just want to challenge your thinking. And I went to 2 Samuel chapter 7, where it says that the David and the one coming, this chosen one, or his line of perpetuity, the house of David, that they would be, or he would be as a son, and God would be as a father to him. And there's that father-son relationship. And he looked at the English text and he goes, oh, it probably doesn't say that in Hebrew. And I said, oh no, I have a Hebrew Bible. Look, let's look at it. He goes, let's forget about it. But then you get to the end of John chapter 1, and Nathanael is sitting there and he sees Jesus coming, and Jesus says something that blows Nathanael's mind. And Nathanael says to Jesus, you truly are the Son of God. That's 2 Samuel chapter 7, the King of Israel. So that King, Son of God mentality and King of Israel are one word. And so in Psalm chapter 72, to see the universal nature of the Davidic promise, Solomon writes this psalm, and it says, endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. And it goes down to verse 8. May he rule, this king from Israel, may he rule from sea to sea. And may the river to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes bow down before him, and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish of distant shores bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring him gifts. May all kings bow down to this King of Israel. May all kings bow down to him, and all nations serve him. So you see from Psalm 72 that this Davidic promise wasn't just something for Israel, that like the Abrahamic promise that had a universal nature to it, God would bless all the families of the earth through Abraham. Again, with this Davidic promise riding on the Abrahamic promise, there's again this concept that from Jerusalem, the King of Kings would rule. All of the nations again would come, and God would bless all the nations of the world through this king. So again, you see that universal element of the Davidic promise as it's enacted in an earthly sense, in a real sense, and from Jerusalem.
That's great. It's going to be an exciting day when a righteous king rules, and there will not be injustices. I mean, when that happens, they'll be quickly and severely dealt with, right? But a righteous king, and we get the wonderful privilege as the church age believers in the church age to rule and reign with him. And as Steve mentioned, those who come to faith in the Messiah, who are enlightened during the tribulation period, will have their physical bodies and enter into that glorious day. And we'll have our glorified bodies, and we'll be ruling with him. So that's very exciting. Looking forward to that day. And I know you gentlemen are too.
Yep.
Well, we are running out of time for this episode. We could look at a lot of things in the life of David, and certainly we could look at the moral failure of David and the devastating consequences it had on his family. Right? There was a lot there. And again, the biblical text is honest with these men of faith, as well in their victories as well as their failures. But gentlemen, as we wrap up today's podcast, what are some lessons we can learn from the life of David, either his failures or victories, and the covenant made with David?
Well, I have to go back to the very fact that David had a heart for God. I don't think that, and you actually said it, Paul, so well, that when we think of whatever it is we do, it doesn't matter what we do. We certainly need qualifications for different lines of ministry or work, as it might be. But what kind of heart do we have for God? How do we, is God our first, are we saved? But then do we really love God? I ask myself that all the time. There have been martyrs in the past who who, that's it, they'd rather be lit up like a candle than turn away from God. And here we are in a pandemic as we're recording this, all kinds of challenges. Do I have a heart for God during this time? And what are the challenges that I might face? Because David faced a lot of challenges, but his heart was always knit towards God. And last week we talked about Abraham, the same thing. We need to be people of faith and carry that out every day, one day at a time. And I guess for me, I look at David that way. Certainly was a great warrior. He certainly had difficulties in his life, but he had a heart for God.
Paul, years ago, I did this program called Walk Through the Bible, and I learned something. Saul, bad king. David, good king.
I've done that too.
So. You remember that?
Yes.
And, the more and more I studied David's life, I thought that is a bad representation because, quite honestly, David's sin was as grievous as Saul's sin and Solomon's sin. The difference was more in the attitude and like what Steve was saying, the heart that David had towards God. Because I think the issue that Saul had was that Saul thought, I'm the king. I deserve accolades. I'm the one in charge. I have the power. And I'm going to find any way to make sure I keep that power and hold that power and all of that. And Solomon lost his way in assimilating with all the different cultures and whatnot. But the thing that happened with David that always strikes me is that David understood his position as the king of Israel. And for David, he knew that the true king of Israel isn't me. It's Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am merely the one who represents him on earth. And I think David knew that because David would quote the Lord often. That means he was in God's word. That means he knew God. And, because David knew his position, I think that's what made him a king, a man after God's own heart, was because he knew the true king is the Lord. It isn't me. And so even in moments of failure, if David's failure and victory are razor thin in where you actually find his true relationship with the Lord, because his failure, especially with Bathsheba, is the same thing that brought one of his greatest victories, which was his repentant heart that God turned toward. So that turned him toward God and found forgiveness and reconciliation. And so for me, it's knowing the position. It's God. David knew his position. And you know what? I have to always remind myself, what's your position, Chris? Because Jesus is the king. He is the one over all. What's your position? How do you fit into this thing? I think that's what made David a man after God's own heart. And I want to be a man after God's own heart. And so I looked to how David did that. And it was through an attitude of humility and understanding of who the true king is.
Great insights, Steve. Thank you, Chris. Well, thank you both of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join me for the recording of these two podcasts. And thank you for the great work that you are accomplishing with Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. I know it's for his glory. And to our listeners here at the Word of Life Bible Institute, we have begun several initiatives to encourage believers to learn the Word. The initiatives are all part of the Learn the Word family of resources. In addition to the Learn the Word podcast, we have the Learn the Word video courses, which are free. We've released 5 Bible courses with 5 more to be released in the future. To take advantage of those great resources, visit us at learn.wol for Word of Life, wol.org. That's learn.wol.org. It's an excellent resource for your own personal edification, for small group Bible studies, for a Sunday school class. We have also released 5 Learn the Word books, 3 covering the whole New Testament and 1 on the Old Testament on the Pentateuch, with another 3 to be released on the Old Testament in the coming months. You can learn more about those also at learn.wool.org and click on the Books tab. One last thing, would you take the time to familiarize yourself with the great work of Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry? It's a ministry that's doing a great work and worthy of your support. You can visit them at foi.org. That's foi.org. And Chris, if they want to listen to your podcast or your radio program, how can they tune into that?
Yeah, FOI is in Friends of Israel, foiradio.org.
Awesome. Well, I hope you'll join us again next week for another great podcast. But until next time, make it your ambition to learn the Word.